are thankful that you are tuning in and are part of the service. We welcome our Sault Ste. Marie campus, all those watch groups that watch us, of course, TV, radio, all that. So glad that you're here. And if you're a first-time guest that happened to say, hey, it is post-blizzard, I think I'll go to church day. We're glad you're here. And we would love to connect with you, meet you. If you take one of those tickets in the seat back in front of you, fill it out. When the service is over, my wife and I will be out in the hub by the cafe. Bring it to us. We'd love to meet you, connect with you, give you a gift. And we're just glad that you're here this morning. If you have a Bible, you're using your device this morning, find your way to Acts chapter 21, would you? Acts chapter 21. We're going to continue the series we started a couple of weeks ago called The Long Road Home. And we're taking a total of 10 weeks to walk through the life of one of the most amazing men who've ever lived, the Apostle Paul, from the ending of his third missionary journey through the ending of his life when he's beheaded in Rome. And as we do this, here's kind of what we're going to see. This entire time span, it'll begin today. Paul will spend almost all of it. There'll be a little bit of a reprieve, but he will spend almost all of it, years, in prison, in jail. It's not going to be great circumstances. He's going to endure great hardship. But here's what we're going to discover. Paul is going to choose to remain faithful during this time of hardship. And as a result, God is going to open up opportunities for him to share Jesus with people who otherwise he never would have had the opportunity. Now, this is important for you and I to know. We need to understand that God's will often brings hardship into our life. And our goal during that time of hardship should be to remain faithful. Because if we'll remain faithful, God will open up doors for us to share Jesus with people who otherwise we never would have had that opportunity. We're going to see Paul remaining faithful. When he gets right to the end, he's going to be able to say, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. Now, last Sunday, we saw two words that really described Paul in this phase of his life. One was the word determination. He was determined to follow God's will, even though he knew God had revealed to him and many others that it would require hardship. He was still determined. And secondly, was the word humility. Paul was willing to put his own preferences, his own rights, his own position below the need for unity in the church and the purpose of the church. Now, where we left off last week was this. Paul gets to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he realizes there's a problem. And the leaders of the church say, Paul, the Jewish believers here in Jerusalem, they don't like you. Your approval rating is very low. And here's why. Because they have been told, and they've bought it, they've been told that you are against the law and you are against Jewish custom. Now, we know that's not true. In fact, remember, Paul wanted to get to Jerusalem in time to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. That was part of the Old Testament law. That was part of Jewish custom. He has Timothy circumcised. That's part of Jewish law. That's part of Jewish custom. Paul wasn't against it at all. Paul simply taught this. Jewish law cannot get you to God. Obeying the law will not get you to heaven. It's not bad to obey the law, obviously. But the only way you can have a relationship with God is through faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so as a result, people in Jerusalem had been told and were believing Paul was against it. So here's what the church leaders said we want you to do. They said, we have 4 men who've recently taken a Nazirite vow, and we talked about what that was last week. And when that vow came to an end, the last 7 days of it, you had certain rituals and sacrifices you had to make at the temple. And they said, Paul, these 4 guys are ready to end it. We want you to go with them. We want you to stand with them. That's going to show the Jewish people you're not against Jewish law. You're not against Jewish custom. In fact, we also want you to pay for all of their sacrifices. Now, I told you that was a large amount of money, because the meat required in sacrifices for just one of those guys could have fed 100 people at a feast. Now there's 4 of them. This is enough meat to feed 400 people. And they say, Paul, we want you to pay for it. And Paul said, I'll do it. I'll lower my rights. I'll lower my preferences. I'll do what you say to bring unity to the church. So as we pick up the story in Acts 21 and verse 27, Paul and these 4 guys are going to go into the temple in order to do these rituals and do these sacrifices. And here's what it says. Acts 21 verse 27. When the 7 days were almost over. What 7 days? The 7 days that you had to do to end your Nazirite vow, that included the ritual and the sacrifices and the cutting your hair and everything else. When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, now that would be Asia Minor. Now the capital city, really the most important city in Asia Minor, was Ephesus. And I believe that these are some unbelieving Jews who have come to Jerusalem for Pentecost from the city of Ephesus. Now, they would not like Paul, because in their mind, Paul was a traitor. Paul was teaching its faith in Jesus. They believed you had to obey the law in order to be right with God. Now, I believe they're from Ephesus because in a moment we're going to see that they identify by sight one of Paul's traveling companions named Trophimus, who was also from Ephesus. And by the way, Paul spent nearly 3 years in Ephesus on his last journey. And so they knew him. They didn't like him. So these Jews, these unbelieving Jews from Ephesus, seeing Paul in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on Paul. They seized him. Now, by the way, when it says they stirred up the crowd, that Greek word, this is the only time it's used in the New Testament, and it literally means to cause confusion. So what did these Jewish unbelievers who hated Paul from Ephesus do? They caused great confusion among the Jews that were at the temple. We'll see it in a minute, because when the Romans say to the crowd, what's this man done? And the Bible says some are going to say he did one thing, some are going to say he did another thing. They have no idea. This is mob mentality. They're confused. And it says, verse 28, these men cried out, men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man, and here comes the accusations against Paul. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people. He's against the Jews. They're basically saying he's anti-Semitic. He preaches against the law. He's against the law of Moses, the customs of the Jews. And he's against this place, the temple. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple. He's defiled this holy place. And they said this because they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and they supposed Paul had brought him into the temple. So all the city was provoked. The people rushed together. They took hold of Paul. They dragged him out of the temple, and they shut the doors. And we'll see in just a moment, they're going to try to kill him. They're going to try to kill him. Now, let's notice the accusations against him, because they're really threefold. Accusation number one, he's against the Jewish people. Accusation number two, he's against the law of Moses. Now, I'm going to pause here, because I need to give you a piece of historical information that will add to why these people were so angry and wanted to kill Paul over this. Because remember, this is the Feast of Pentecost. Now that's a big day in Jerusalem. Pentecost was one of 3 feasts held annually in which every Jewish man was required by the law to come to Jerusalem to celebrate. Historians say at the time of Pentecost, over 2 million people would fill the city of Jerusalem. Now, what is Pentecost? Well, it started basically as a celebration of the beginning of the wheat harvest. That's how it started. But it had grown into something else. Penta, meaning 50, Pentecost occurred 50 days after Passover. Now, the Jewish custom, the Bible doesn't teach this, it could be true. Jewish custom is this, that after the very first Passover that happened in Egypt, when the people left slavery in Egypt, it was 50 days after the Passover that God gave Moses the law on Mount Sinai. So Pentecost had become a celebration of the law of Moses. It was a time to celebrate basically the birthday of the law. It was a time when Jewish people who believed you had to follow the law to be right with God and get to heaven would come to Jerusalem and celebrate how great the law was. Now do you understand why this crowd would get really fired up when they're told that Paul was preaching that the law didn't matter? So there's a huge amount of emotion in the city. And not only that, the third accusation is he spoke against the temple. He degraded the temple, and they gave an example. Now, it's a false example. It's a false witness. They had no evidence because it never happened. They said, do you know what this man did? He degraded the temple by bringing a Greek, a Gentile named Trophimus from the city of Ephesus into the temple area. Now, had Paul done that? No. In fact, Luke makes it very clear. They made this up because they knew Trophimus was traveling with Paul in Jerusalem. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, to understand the Bible theologically, you have to understand the Bible historically. So let me give you a little bit of history. The temple in Jerusalem sat on what's called the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is huge, 35 acres. Huge. It's still there today. And the Temple Mount had different areas where only certain people were allowed. So the most inner area was the court of the priests. And only priests, who obviously were Jewish, were allowed in there. Outside of that was what was called the court of Israel. Now, in the court of Israel, only Jewish men were allowed there. Jewish women were not. But outside the court of Israel was the court of women. Any Jew could be in that court, male or female. But outside of that court was the largest court, and that was called the court of the Gentiles. Anybody could be there. Trophimus could have been there, no problem. But in between the court of the Gentiles and the court of the women were barriers. And on these barriers were signs. And archaeology has uncovered at least 2 of these signs. You can see one of them in the museum in Jerusalem. I've seen it. And basically the sign, if I can just paraphrase it, says this: any Gentile who crosses this barrier has no one to blame but themselves for their death. It was capital punishment. If a Gentile crossed the barrier into the court of the women, where only Jews could be, he was killed. Now, by the way, remember when the Romans took over, they took the Jewish right of capital punishment away from them. That's why the Jewish people had to take Jesus to Pilate. But there was one exception. The only exception in which the Jews were allowed to do capital punishment was right in this situation. If a Gentile came into the Jewish area of the temple ground, the Jews had the right, the permission under the Romans to kill them. That's how serious it was. All right? And so they're saying, do you know what Paul did? He brought this Gentile into this area. It was false. He hadn't done that. Now, I find this ironic. And let me tell you why I find this ironic. Go back to Acts chapter 6 for a moment. Because in Acts chapter 6, Stephen is falsely accused of the same things and sentenced to death. Look at Acts 6, verse 13. And they put forward false witnesses against Stephen, just like these Jews from Ephesus were giving false witness about Paul. And they said, this man incessantly speaks against the holy place, the temple, and against the law of Moses. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down to us. Now, what's ironic about it? What's ironic about the fact that Stephen is going to be stoned for the same false accusations that are now being levied against Paul? Here's what's ironic. Look at Acts chapter 8 and verse number 1. Before Paul found Jesus, his name was Saul. And look what it says. And Saul was in hearty agreement with putting Stephen to death. Don't you find that ironic? That Paul is now being falsely accused of the very thing that he was in agreement with Stephen being falsely accused of and sentenced to death. So what happens? Acts 21. Look at verse number 31. And I want you to know that they are about ready to kill Paul. Now, by the way, to kill Paul would have been breaking their own Jewish law. Because if a Gentile came into the Jewish crowd, you could kill the Gentile. You could not kill a Jew. So why are they going after Paul instead of Trophimus? Because Trophimus isn't there. It never happened. They just want reason to kill Paul. So look at it. Verse 31. While they, that Jewish mob led by these Jewish unbelievers from Ephesus, while they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Now stop. Right next to the Temple Mount, literally attached to it on the north side, is what's called the Antonio Fortress. And it's a tall building in which the Roman authorities lived. It was in this fortress that they would have brought Jesus before Pilate. And what would happen is this. During the days in which there were feasts in Jerusalem and so many people were there, 1,000 Roman soldiers would be assigned to stay at this fortress. They're under the leadership of a commander. This commander we'll learn later is named Claudius. We won't learn that today, but we'll learn it later. His name is Claudius. Now, what is their job? One job. Their job is to make sure no unrest or riots break out. That's their job. All these people here, mass of people, millions of people, make sure no unrest happens. Because you see, the Romans feared unrest and riots more than just about anything. Why? Because there were more slaves in the Roman Empire than free people. And if suddenly riots and unrest began to spread, it would be big problems. So the Romans had to snuff it out quickly. And that's what this commander is there to do. Now, from the top of the fortress, you could see out over the entire Temple Mount. Guards are watching. Roman soldiers are watching. They see this massive mob. And it looks like they're really going towards one guy. So they send word to the commander. He's concerned because he's got to snuff this out. Because if a riot happens, it will cost him for sure his position, maybe his life. So verse 32 says, at once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they, the Jewish mob, saw the Roman commander and the Roman soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. What were they doing? They were wanting to beat him to death. Now by this time, he probably took quite a beating. Now, there would have been steps that came down right from the fortress onto the Temple Mount. So Claudius and his soldiers come down, and when they get there, the crowd stops. So look at verse 33 and note what happens. Then the commander came up and took hold of Paul and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Now, this will be important for a couple reasons. Number one, it will be important because it was against Roman law to bind, to chain a Roman citizen who has not yet been condemned of a crime, who we don't even know if he's guilty of anything. And Paul, by the way, is a Roman citizen. He got that through his dad. How his dad became a Roman, we're kind of unsure, but he got it through his dad. Now, the second reason this is significant is because remember last week, if you were here, remember the prophecy that the prophet Agabus gave? He said, when you go to Jerusalem, and he took Paul's belt and he tied it around his own arms and said, you'll be arrested. The prophecy has come true. Paul is now in chains. Now, we'll learn in just a second that as this goes on, this commander Claudius is going to have an idea of maybe who Paul is. I don't know if he just kind of thought that or somebody whispered it to him, but we'll see it. But notice what happens next. It says in the end of verse 33, he began asking who the man was and what he had done. So he's saying to the crowd, who is it? What has this man done? Now notice the confusion. Verse 34, among the crowd, some were shouting one thing, some were shouting another thing, and when Claudius could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered the man to be taken up the steps into the barracks of the fortress. Do you see the confusion? This is mob mentality at its best. They don't even have a clue why they're fired up. They're just fired up. They don't really have a clue exactly why they want to kill the guy. There's confusion. So Claudius wants to do 2 things. Number one, let's get this guy kind of off to the side. But maybe that will calm down the crowd if the guy's not there anymore. Because remember, his number one desire is to snuff out the unrest. All right, let's pick it up in verse number 35. And when Paul got to the stairs that would lead up into the barracks of the fortress, he was carried by the soldiers. He didn't walk up the stairs. They had to literally pick him up and carry him. Why? Because of the violence of the mob. The mob is trying to get to Paul through the soldiers. For the multitude of the people were following them, going up the stairs, shouting, away with him. That doesn't mean lock him up. Away with him means kill him. We want him dead. Now, what happens next becomes pretty interesting. They literally have to carry him up the steps. Let's pick it up in verse 37. As Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, so he's at the top of the steps now, he said to the commander, to Claudius, look what he says. May I say something to you? Now, I love Paul's calmness. This crowd is trying to get to him through Claudius. Claudius basically has the power of life and death. Paul has been falsely accused, falsely chained. He's been falsely arrested. But he's still very respectful. May I say something to you? And when he said that to Claudius, he spoke in Greek. Now, how do we know he spoke in Greek? Look at Claudius's response. And Claudius said, whoa, time out. You know Greek? He didn't expect that. Because to know Greek would tell you he might be a Roman citizen. To know Greek would tell you he was highly educated. Now we see who Claudius thought he might have been. Keep reading. Well, if you know Greek, he says, verse 38, then you're not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 men called dagger men, men of the assassins, out into the wilderness. Now let me back up. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says that in AD 54, there was this Egyptian rebel terrorist who had a group of thousands of men, and the word that was used to describe them is a word that means dagger men. They carried daggers under their robes, and they were assassins. And they would mingle through the crowd to get close to a dignitary, and then they would kill the dignitary. And what happened is the Romans went after them, and the Romans killed many of them. The Romans imprisoned many of them, but some of them got away, including the leader. He got away. They've been looking for him for 3 years by this time. And there were different times in Jewish life, especially at feasts, where these assassins would show their ugly heads. There'd be a stabbing over here or a stabbing over there. And Claudius is thinking, and maybe somebody told him this might be the guy. This might be the leader. If I play my cards right, I could get a huge promotion out of this. But then when Paul speaks in Greek, Claudius says, uh-oh, I don't think it's the guy. So look at verse 39. Paul said, I'm a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city. In fact, Tarsus was considered a free city in the Roman Empire. And he says, I beg you, here's my request. Please let me speak to the people. I think my request would have been, please free me out the back door where the people can't see. Paul didn't ask for his freedom. He didn't ask for a special favor, other than I'd like to speak to this massive crowd who have been beating me and want me dead. Now, why would Paul want to speak to that crowd? One reason. Because Paul has a deeper passion, a deeper concern than his own well-being. Paul's deepest concern is the salvation of these Jewish people. Paul has experienced hardship in coming to Jerusalem, no doubt. He's been beaten and arrested after being falsely accused. He's staying faithful, and he knows that if he'll be faithful, God will give him opportunity to share Jesus. So what happens? It says, verse 40, when the commander gave him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people. And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect. And what does he give them? His story. His story. Now, on the last Sunday of last year, we looked again at Paul's story of how he came to know Jesus. We looked at how Luke described it in Acts 9, and we looked at different details that Paul added in Acts 22 and 26. And we did that so when we get to these passages, we could kind of skip over them. I encourage you still to read that portion. But basically, as I told you, Paul's story had 3 parts. Here's what my life was like before I found Christ. Here's how I found Christ. Here's how my life has changed since I found Christ. And Paul shares that story with the mob. I love the simplicity of it. Because friends, listen. That's how you tell your story today. In John chapter 9, there was a man born blind. Jesus touched him and healed him. The Pharisees and religious leaders were mad and said, "We give God glory. Just admit that man's a fraud." And I love how this man responded. He said, whether he's a fraud or not, I guess I can't tell you. All I know is this: I was blind. That's what my life was like before I met him. He touched me. That's how I met him. Now I can see. That's how my life has changed. And friends, that's your story too if you know Jesus. Your story answers 3 questions. Question number 1, what was your life like before finding Christ? Question number 2, how did you find Christ? Question number 3, how's your life changed since you found Christ? The greatest thing you can do in this new year is to tell someone your story. And that's what Paul does. And the people listen intently until Paul says one thing. When you get ultimately to verse number 21 of chapter 22, we won't read it. Paul says, and after I found Christ, God has sent me to the Gentiles so they can know our God. Now, when he said that, the uproar started all over again. Why? Because the Jewish people hated the Gentiles. Do you realize there are some ancient rabbinical writings that tell us that the mindset was this? The only reason Jews thought, the only reason God created Gentiles to begin with was so he had fuel to keep hell hot. That's how much they hated him. And when Paul says, now God sent me to the Gentiles so they can be part of the family, they're going, no way. So pick up the story in Acts 22, verse 22. They listened to him up to this statement. And that was the statement about the Gentiles. And when they raised their voices, they said, away with such a fellow from the earth. He should not be allowed to live. Does this sound vaguely familiar to another story? Because it was in this same area that the crowd would have yelled out about Jesus. Crucify him. And it says in verse 23, as they were crying out, they were throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust in the air. That almost sounds silly, doesn't it? But understand what it meant. What was the number one way Jews would carry out capital punishment? They would stone the person. And when they stoned the person, they would take big stones. And usually they were up top, the person's down in a valley, and they would hurl the stones down on top of them until they died. Well, in order to be able to do that, you had to kind of take off your cloaks, your outer robes, so you could move a little more. So when they start ripping off their cloaks, that's what they want to do. If you remember, when Stephen was stoned, they took off their cloaks, and Saul actually held them while they stoned Stephen. You say, okay, but why are they throwing dust at him? What damage is that going to do? I want you to die. Here's some dust. Well, there's a reason why they were throwing dust. Because up on the Temple Mount, there were no rocks. That's all they could scrounge up off the ground. They want him dead. That's the response of the people. Now notice the response of the commander Claudius in verse 24. The commander ordered that he be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that Claudius might find out the reason why they were shouting against him this way. So here's what the commander does. He goes, whoa, okay, I got the real problem. There's a riot breaking out. I have to snuff it out. My problem is they want this guy dead, and if I don't give them what they want, they're going to explode. It's the same problem Pilate faced with Jesus. Same exact problem. So Claudius says, what I need to do is I need to find out something that makes him a criminal so I can deal with him and the Jews will be happy. And so the way they would examine him to get a confession was to scourge him. Just like they scourged Jesus. Painful. Many men didn't even survive the scourging. Others who did were paralyzed for life. But the whole idea was, we're going to beat you until you confess. And it didn't take many strikes from the whip before you would confess to anything just to get the beating to stop. That's what they're going to do with Paul. So look what it says. Now, Paul knows how to play his cards right. But he does it with such respect. Look at it. Verse number 25. But when they stretched him out with thongs, in other words, in order to get ready to whip him, they would stretch his body out so the skin was nice and taut, so when the whip hit it, it would just explode. Look at this. When they stretched him out and they're getting ready to whip him, Paul says to the centurion, that's not the head commander, this is the guy under him. He says to the centurion who was standing there, Before you start, can I ask you a question? Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and has not been condemned? Have the rules changed? You see, in the Roman law, you could not chain a Roman citizen who hadn't been condemned. You could not scourge or punish one. They've already chained him. They're about ready to scourge him. Do you realize that in Roman law, if you punished a Roman citizen who wasn't condemned, you would die? That's how serious it was. They're getting ready to bring the whip down, and Paul says, excuse me, isn't it still unlawful to whip a Roman citizen who hasn't been condemned? Now this centurion gets scared. He's already chained him. That was illegal. He was about ready to whip him, commanded by Claudius. That would be illegal, could even cost him his life. And so it says, verse 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander, to Claudius, and said, what are you about to do? You're about to make a huge mistake. Oh, Paul knows how to play the cards, doesn't he? For this man is a Roman. We've already broken the law. So the commander Claudius came and said to Paul, tell me, are you a Roman? And Paul said, yes. No. That's not in the Bible, but I kind of think Paul thought it. And the commander answered, well, I acquired my citizenship with a large sum of money. I bought my citizenship, which you could do if you were the right person with the right amount of money. And Paul says, well, actually, I was born a citizen. I didn't have to buy mine. Mine comes by birth. Verse 29, therefore those who were about to examine him, how? By scourging, immediately let go of him. And the commander became afraid when he found out Paul was a Roman, because he already had him put in chains. Now this commander, Claudius, is in a tight spot, isn't he? If he doesn't punish Paul severely, he's going to have a riot outside, and that riot could result in him losing his position or his life. But if he punishes Paul, an uncondemned Roman citizen, he's breaking Roman law himself and could lose his position and even his life. Claudius finds himself between a rock and a hard place. So you know what he does? Come back next week and I'll tell you. But before we wrap it up, I want you to remember this. When God led Paul to Jerusalem, he made it clear it would involve hardship. Ladies and gentlemen, when you follow God's will for your life, it will at times produce hardship. I need you to know that. Because sometimes we have this mistaken notion that if I follow God's will, all my life will be wonderful and beautiful. And the truth of the matter is this. If you have that mindset and God's will brings hardship into your life, it's easy for you to get mad at God. And when you get mad at God, you'll never be faithful. Sometimes God's will does bring hardship into our life. And when it does, our duty is to remain faithful. And if we will remain faithful, God will open up opportunities for us to share our story with people who otherwise we never would have had the opportunity. Paul just had the opportunity to share his story with this huge crowd of Jewish people. Ultimately, he's going to be able to share his story with the leaders in Rome. And ultimately, there will even be individuals working in Caesar's household who will put their faith in Christ. And that's why in Philippians chapter 1, Paul will say to the church of Philippi, all the hardship I have endured, it's resulted in the furtherance of the gospel. God will never bring hardship into your life for nothing. Every hardship he brings into your life will be an opportunity, ultimately, for you to share Jesus with someone else. And here's the truth. When you become bitter about the hardship and you quit being faithful, that doesn't mean the hardship goes away. That just means you go through the hardship for nothing. But when you remain faithful, that hardship will result in you having opportunity to share your story of what your life was like before you found Christ, how you found Christ, and how your life has changed. Jeff's going to take over up at the Sioux. Kevin down at the chapel. Here in the main auditorium, would you stand with me, please? So, Father, I pray, help us to be faithful. In whatever hardship you allow into our life, help us to be faithful. And in being faithful, see you give us opportunities to share our story with others. And we give you praise. In Jesus' name. Amen. You see, hardships will come. But God has a way of taking hardships and using them for good. How many of you know the Bible is true when it says, all things work together for good to those who love Jesus? How many of you know that's true? That's true, right? How many of you know that we serve a God who can take the hardships of your life and use them for his honor and his glory? Do you believe that this morning? How many of you this morning believe that we serve a God who can take the ashes of our life and make beauty grow out of them? Do you believe that this morning? I know it's snowy, I know it's cold, but warm up, folks. Warm up. How many of you believe that we serve a God who can take the graves of our life and bring them into gardens? Do you believe it this morning?